Okay, hello. Greetings, everyone.
Greetings.
I will now call this meeting to order. The first order of business tonight is to adopt the agenda for tonight's meeting. May I have a motion?
Motion to adopt the agenda.
Second.
Second. I have a motion. I have a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Hearing none, the motion carries. Thank you. Boy, that was the easiest in months. Thank you. Next order of business is to adopt the minutes from our June 16th meeting. May I have a motion?
Motion to adopt the minutes.
May I have a second?
Second.
I have a motion. I have a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay. Hearing none. Motion moves forward. Carries. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I could I ask your indulgence to speak for a couple moments?
Sure.
Point of personal privilege. And I ask, I appreciate that, and I ask, this will be a difficult thing for me to say, but this will take just over 2 minutes. I'm speaking on my behalf and on behalf of others in the community, so this isn't just about me, but I wanted to let the council and the community know that on July 31st, I'll be submitting my resignation from the Victoria Planning Commission, and I appreciate you and the commissioners allowing me for just a moment to explain why. Tom Funk, our mayor, asked me to stand for this position a couple of years ago, and I was honored to do it. I believed in many of the changes he was making in the city, as painful and messy and at times overdone as they were. And I've enjoyed many discussions with Tom about our community, which has been my home and my family's home for the last 18 years. However, as Tom has shifted his attention from the city to his run for the Senate, something very ugly has emerged. First, the District 112 referendum was marred by a campaign of fear and racial division. Tom has been very public about his leadership role in that campaign, which I believe will scar this community for years to come. Now, in his Senate campaign, he has again chosen to use fear and racial division as central themes of his campaign. I encourage everyone to watch his campaign videos and ask yourselves, in particular about the video about George Floyd and the video about the District 112's equity program, if this us versus them racial themes are how you want our community to be known across this state if Tom were to reach the Senate. Tom continues to say the efforts to address the racism we've seen in our schools are designed to make white people feel ashamed. I can say with a high degree of confidence that nobody cares about Tom's shame, nor mine, nor anybody in this room. Nobody wants it. It's not productive. What is productive is simply recognizing that the systems and institutions that we've built do not serve all people equally. And it's our job to use the power that we have in positions like the ones that we're in to change those where we can. We can start right here in Victoria. This city does not employ a single African American, and the commissions and the city council are pretty much all white. For me, I'm starting by reluctantly resigning this seat for one reason only, and that's to try to draw attention to the long-term risk to our community that we will suffer if we choose this path of division. It will not end well for us, in my view and in the view of a number of my neighbors. This is not some kind of purity test or woke crusade. I'm not running for anything. I'm just a guy in the neighborhood. It's simply a call for my neighbors to reject racial division, if not in its entirety, at least in the public affairs of our community. It is my hope, Mr. Chairman, that my seat on this commission would be filled by a person of color if possible. And I encourage other community leaders in appointed positions like these to also step down and insist that their seats on these boards and commissions be made more diverse. I also call on Victoria's next mayor to take this issue seriously, as I expect she will. To be clear, I know Tom, I consider Tom a friend, I like Tom. It is not my intention to call Tom Funk a racist, nor do I think he is one, but it's clear that he and those that he's surrounded himself with in this election and these campaigns believe that racial division will benefit them politically, and I think that's a big mistake, and that's a bad thing for our community. So I hope my neighbors will prove them wrong, either in the Republican primary on August 11th, where there's a conservative Republican woman running for that seat as well, or if necessary in the general election this fall. And I certainly hope my actions here tonight will draw positive attention to the issues at stake in our community. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you indulging me being able to read that.
Oh, okay. You're welcome, John. So we're going to continue on. So tonight we have two discussion items. Both of these items are going to have a public hearing. Just as a kind of a reminder, before I open the public hearing, we're going to hear from staff. We'll hear from the applicants if they're here. Then I'll open this up. It'll have a public hearing. Anyone who wants to share their comments with us, just come down to the podium, state your name, your address, and we're happy to have your comments. After the public comments, I will close the public hearing. The commission will have a discussion, and we will take any further action required. So, first on the agenda tonight is public hearing to consider a variance from a swimming pool fence height requirement for the property located 7970 Acorn Circle. Marty.
All right, thank you, Chair, Commissioners. I'm Marty Dahl, Community and Economic Development Director for the City of Victoria. As you mentioned, we do have an application for a variance from the city's swimming pool fence height requirement. That variance is from 7970 Acorn Circle, and the applicants are here this evening, and I believe will wish to speak after our presentation prior to the public hearing opening up. So just so everyone is aware, Victoria Zoning Code Section 1811 on swimming pools specifically states that the surface area or a swimming pool shall be required to be enclosed by a 5-foot safety fence. This application is to request a variance to that requirement in the zoning code. Based on the application that was included in your packet, the property owner is requesting that variance based on the following proposed rationale: the unique nature of the property, and that replacement of the existing fence to a 5-foot fence would have a negative impact on adjacent property owners and impact the look and feel. Also noted industry standards, that existing fence meets the state, national, and international height standards of 48 inches and otherwise is compliant with Victoria City Code. A note about safety considerations and a request that in lieu of adding that 1 foot of height, they would propose to install a powered automatic safety cover. And then some of the existing conditions, that the pool would be located behind the house where they would be able to observe it from their property. So just as a refresher on this board's ability as the Board of Adjustments and Appeals, the city code does have some specific language on when and how a variance can be applied. So I've got a couple of slides that just states that code language, so you can use that as you consider your decision this evening. And that is that the property owner proposes to use the property in a reasonable manner, not permitted by the code. That the plight of the landowner is due to circumstances unique to the property and not created by the landowner or previous landowners. If the variance, if granted, will not alter the essential character of the locality, and that economic considerations alone do not constitute practical difficulties. Additionally, the board may impose conditions in granting a variance, but those conditions must be directly related and must bear a rough proportionality to the impact created by the variance. And then lastly, the board, in the code, it states that the board will not recommend and council will not grant a variance unless they find the following fact: that strict enforcement or interpretation would result in a practical difficulty or undue hardship inconsistent with the intent of the code, that there are exceptional and extraordinary circumstances or conditions applicable to the property use or facilities that do not generally apply in other properties in the same district, that granting a variance will not adversely affect the public health, welfare, and safety and will not be detrimental or injurious to the property or improvements in the neighborhood, and granting of the variance will not allow a use which is otherwise not permitted in the zoning district in question. And just some additional notes that were also included in your background packet for the commission to consider as they make their decision is that industry standards alone cannot be used to grant a variance. They may be used, and in fact are often used when amending a city code to try to be in line with some of those certain standards, but they should not be used as a rationale to grant a variance for an individual property, but rather the planning commission will need to find that the plight of the landowner is due to circumstances that are unique to this property, and that there are exceptional or extraordinary circumstances or conditions applicable to the property use or facilities. So ultimately, the commission will need to consider whether the adverse aesthetic impact of extending the height of this property's fence or adding a second stacked fence due to the requirement of the 5-foot fence in the zoning code meets the thresholds of those requirements that were stated previously. And the commission may also consider whether a 4-foot fence with a cover is as safe or safer than a 5-foot fence. That can also be part of those findings. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Chair. As I mentioned, the applicant is here, and this item does require a public hearing be held.
Would the public applicant like to come up first before I open the public hearing? Sure. Address us? Thanks. Come on up.
Good evening, folks. Ken Goulart, 7970 Acorn Circle. Just a couple of things. I think we put most of it in the application. We hadn't really landed on the pool cover yet. I did want to bring that back to the attention. It's 365. The importance of the safety cover is that it holds 400 pounds when it's closed. It's an auto close. You have to have your thumb on it. You have to have the code to unlock it. So when we look at it from a safety feature, as referenced with the international standard, the safety cover itself actually replaces in many instances because it's just as good as an effective barrier to protect the safety. So I think that was one of the things we did want to bring up. I don't want to eat up a bunch of your guys' time, but we did want to address that. And I think the other feature for us is this is a little unique from most variances you probably see, in that we're dealing with a foot difference on the fence versus maybe a land use change or something much more dramatic. And really the focus for us is from inside our property, a 5-foot fence is going to look like a 5-foot fence. It's from the external side of the property with all the adjacent lots. We just touch a lot of other lots, and it's very visual from a lot of other people. So I think that's probably the key reason why we're walking in. I'll see a 5-foot fence from the inside if that's what it is, but realistically, we think we're actually exceeding the safety standard of the 5-foot fence when we put that safety cover on top of the existing 4-foot fence. And we think it preserves what the nature and the look and the feel of our community and our adjacent landowners. So I can answer any questions, or should I sit down at this point in time, or what do you guys want?
Well, I think since you're here, we'll open the public hearing, see if anybody's here for this, and then when we have our discussion, since you're here, if some questions come up, we'll invite you to come up and we can answer them at that point.
All right, great, thank you.
I'm sure some will.
All right,
Thanks for
appreciate
coming
it.
down. Okay, so I will now open the public hearing. Would anyone like to step forward? Going once, going twice, going 3 times. Can I have a motion to close the public hearing, please?
I move that we close the public hearing.
Can I have a second? Okay, I have a motion, I have a second. All in favor of closing the public hearing, say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. Hearing none, motion carries. Public hearing is closed. Okay, commissioners, I'm sure there's some thoughts. And by the way, I just want to say, first off, thank you for coming down. When this came before us and we were talking about changing everything, I think this is a really appropriate way to handle this, especially when I saw the package. So thank you for taking it kind of the next step. I'm sure it took longer than you wanted, but hopefully we get some resolution. Okay. Who was?
I'd like to speak. I think the safety cover, actually, I was looking at those before I saw their packet as a possible solution or alternative. So my belief is the safety cover with the 4-foot fence would be safer than the 5-foot fence. As far as the variance, I actually would extend this out, that if we grant this variance, but we actually should work to change the code for anybody. So in other words, anybody who wants to do a 4-foot fence with a safety cover should be permissible, not just for the variance group, because the safety covers are probably a newer, relatively newer product than when that code was first put into effect. And they can be a very, very good alternative. So those are my thoughts. I'm for their variance, but I'm also for changing the code.
Okay. Anybody else?
I'm just curious what the cost for a cover like this is. I mean, I certainly believe in the importance of safety, having children and children myself. I just, if that's something that's explored,
Well, they're expensive. That would be somebody's choice, right? You could either do the 5-foot fence or a 4-foot with the safety cover, but I think we should allow that for anybody who might want that, right? But when you start reviewing the covers, they're pricier than you think. I can't, he maybe could come
Yeah,
and
I'm
speak to
guessing,
that.
I'm going to guess, we'll count, we'll save our questions, and we'll have you back. But I'm guessing you're well over 10, you're probably between $10,000 and $20,000.
Right. Right. So I think this is a special circumstance. They already have the fence, so, I don't think that as a city, they'd see a ton of applications like this. So I think, in my opinion, I think it's acceptable. I don't think that, the city will be overrun with requests on this front, but I think we should be open-minded in this instance. And I think that safety is certainly a priority for the reasons you have.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Christian?
We have a letter from Drew and Kaylee Carlson giving you the thumbs up. How many other neighbors do you have, and did you ask them? And is there any reason why we don't see anything from them as well?
We're going to hold that for a second, because for that answer, I need them up at the microphone. So we'll just wait for a second, but good question. So we're keeping track.
Thanks.
Anything else, comment-wise?
No, I'm about neighbors. Granted, people move and things move out after that, but if it's something that all of that group wants, I think we should seriously consider it.
John, you're looking at me.
As a point of reference, I'm on the homeowner association board. And so there is issues that come up on a very regular basis. And of course, everything sets a precedent.
Right.
I had read through the packet. I think there's a couple of two real key issues in this. Number one is the neighbors. And the neighbors are saying, in terms of appearance and in terms of our own interests, we don't have a problem at all with it. But I think safety is the intent, and I think that was addressed very, very well. And I think that's that's certainly one of the concerns that there would be. So I would certainly be in favor of the variance request.
Mr. Brownlee?
How high is this? Do you have any idea? This height?
You're putting me on the spot.
Yeah, I know.
I don't know.
It's probably about 4 feet.
It's probably 48 inches.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably
3.5.
No, it's shorter.
Is it?
No, that's not 4.
Do we have a tape measure?
She's standing on a step.
I think,
3.5 feet.
Probably find one.
I guess there's part of me that's just a little bit curious. John, are you on the homeowners association board of this development?
No,
Oh, okay.
no, not at all. No, my own neighborhood.
Right. Because that would be
No,
dramatic.
if I were, I would have to recuse myself.
Yeah, right. My only question about this, I think it all makes sense and it's reasonable, is the question of precedent. And then also, when you're done at night, you have to, this doesn't have an auto auto close functionality, you're not at the microphone yet. So my only little bit of concern here is we're going with, it's a lower fence. I think 4 feet is probably manageable by just about anybody in terms of getting over. But we got to make sure that if we're relying on the cover, we got to make sure it's getting closed every night, right? And that's the only, and I'm in favor of the variance, but in terms of changing the whole set of rules, and the reason I guess I'm in favor of the variance is that it looks like all these fences interconnect with each other.
Yeah.
So we're doubling down on the safety, and if they've got a 5-foot fence sticking up, and it's just gonna, it doesn't seem like we got a lot of risk for something that might create some aesthetic, challenges in the neighborhood. But if we're going to look at this more broadly speaking, and I'd like to know a little bit more about these covers, and if they sort of have an automatic at midnight they go unless they're overridden or whatever, just in case, because I know what I would do, I'd forget to push the button, 100%.
Well, you got to close it when everybody's out of the pool. Closing the gate to the fence would be just as critical,
That's a good point.
even without a
That's a good
pool
point. I
cover.
like your
Right,
thought
yeah. But
So that'd be my only question, but I think this is perfectly reasonable. Does anybody know, is there any statistical difference, was that in here, between 4-foot fence and 5-foot fence in terms of incidents and so forth?
No, we did not do that level of digging into the differences.
And I dug pretty deep last time and today again, and I didn't find any of that either. And then I did some more digging into the, when I first, not being a pool guy, that automatic closure, I thought, oh, it snaps shut somehow. And like you stated, no, it relies on you closing it. And I think obviously, it's come a long ways in the last 15 to 20 years also. And I mean, you just look at California and you look at how they accept it, a state with a lot of pools. But there's still some concerns with that. And one of the things that stood out to me is that cover is still replaced, or typically needs to be replaced about every 5 years. And so then that leads me to believe, just like closing it, how do you make sure it's going to be closed? How do you make sure that 5 years down the road that ripped cover is replaced? How do you make sure that if mechanically it doesn't, because it's on basically a trolley system that closes, if that's down, it's down, it's open. And
So I think you're raising actually a pretty important point. I hadn't thought about this until you just mentioned this. So I'm sure the applicant is going to, they're investing a lot of money into this pool and there's a lot there. They're obviously going to take care of it. Is there anything we're able to do from in terms of guaranteeing the long-term maintenance of that? And what about the next owner who has a pool but who wants to take it out? Can they take it out? And how do we by take it out, I mean take the cover off. We don't like the cover, we want to take it off. And now they have a 4-foot fence and no cover. To what extent are we able to control the long tail of this? That's, I actually hadn't thought about that until right now.
Well,
Marty, do we have a solution for that? Or I mean, is there a way that
Yes.
it could be inspected every so many years to make sure it's functioning?
Right, so as I mentioned, our code does allow the planning commission to recommend conditions be placed on any variance. So those conditions would then also run concurrent with that variance in the property. So for example, if a condition was that it must have a cover, industry standard automated power cover that's kept in good
Fully
proper
functional.
working order, something like that, that would then be a condition on the property. To your point, Commissioner Brownlee and others, if there were, right now, we do not necessarily have the capacity or have it as part of our inspections process that we would build in ongoing continued inspections of these types of things or periodic. So it would really be one of those issues that it would fall to the trust of the homeowner to maintain that. And then like any of our other code compliance issues, it would be, at least as we sit today, a complaint or reaction-based issue if someone were to call and say there was an issue with this cover's no longer on the pool or something like that.
Okay. You guys want to come back up? Maybe we'll. Is there anything else, you guys, from our discussions? Come on. So we had two questions. One kind of, you don't have to tell us how much you're paying for, but the ballpark on pricing for these.
They far exceed a fence.
Yeah, that's
I can tell you that much. I think that does play into Mr. Brownlee's point too. It's so much cheaper to replace the cover itself versus the mechanical and everything else. So once we've made that investment, every intention is to maintain it. As far as closing it at night, the primary additional value for these is maintaining the heat, keeping them clean and everything else. So the goal would, of course, to be always closing it, and that would be the intention because that's a huge value to us to maintain that with the pool itself. But to your point, I guess you could. There is no safety feature for an auto close, and that's due to the risk of having a pet or a person or an individual in the pool. So that's not available, but the technology itself, I think they handle 400 or 500 pounds. You can walk on it. Pets can walk on it.
It's on a track, so there's
Yeah.
no way to get in the pool.
Yeah, so maintenance though is relatively simple on these, but after that initial investment, the cost to even replace if you had a rip or tear in the liner or the cover, it's very affordable to go do that versus completely removing it off of your pool, so.
We already did inquire about the cost of replacing the cover.
Yeah, what's the long-term cost of us maintaining this is one of those things.
Commissioner Pedersen had a question. We received the one letter in the packet from one of your neighbors. Did you have a chance to talk to any others, or?
We did talk to all the ones that were adjacent on the sides of us, we did not
And
talk
across
to the
the
rear,
street.
across the street.
And a couple others that received letters outside of our circle.
I would say part of it's just, you can submit if you'd like to, they're fine with it, we didn't have any objections, and I think most everybody's like, well, yeah, go for it, if you need something, let me know, and we just didn't ask for that. We do have HOA approval already from the Lake Ridge HOA, so I can tell you that, we did get approval back from the HOA, submitted the packet, and so we do have that in possession as well, so.
Ken used to be president of our HOA, so he has
Many, many years
experience
ago.
there.
Yes.
So was that, just out of curiosity, when you presented it to them, was that with the standard fence you have now, the 48-inch and pool cover?
Yeah, we presented that we've applied for the full packet plus the variance, and so
Okay.
there was no objection coming back from the HOA.
Okay.
But we did indicate that we had submitted both ways.
And we would comply if we didn't get the variance.
Great. Any other questions, anybody?
I assume a pool could add to the cost of your homeowner's insurance? And I was curious if your homeowner's insurance carrier would give you some kind of discount for having the safety pool cover, just like they do when you have like a security system.
We haven't verified that, but there was definitely no objection when we said we were looking at a safety cover on top of it, so.
I'm just curious if their analysis would say, hey, that's beneficial. That's really the only reason I was asking.
Yeah, I think it's, again, I think one of the points again is the 4 foot is the standard, and I think there was a question about the technical committee or the technical standards organization between 4 and 5. They've set it at 4 because clearly 3 or 38 or something lower was too low, but usually the technical committees are going to set a standard where they're statistically irrelevant as you move up.
And our 5-foot fence comes up to here.
4 foot fence.
Or 4 foot.
Yeah.
It comes up to here.
Yeah, so I think that's what I would say. In my background, I'm a technical manager for damage prevention, so the technical standards committees are something I'm very well versed in, and they're going to set that standard, and statistically it has to be almost irrelevant. I don't have the number. I couldn't find it either. I did a lot of digging. But once they've set that standard, obviously 3 is way too low, or this level here is too low. They've decided 4 is the statistically relevant number for the standards, so.
What we saw from that pool safety council out of Maryland was 4 is the standard. They just said 5 would be better. But they probably said, they probably would have said 6 or 7 would be even
In
better,
1975,
right?
they said 6, actually. I did find the brochure from 1975.
Put
so
barbed
if-
wire around the top and
We
all
do
sorts
have
of
a
stuff.
picture of the auto cover.
Yeah, if anybody does want to see it, we did bring the brochure.
I saw them. I looked at plenty today.
Yeah,
They're nice.
we did, and I appreciate that. And I do want to say thank you for everybody who has put their time in and volunteered to be on this commission. I was a past commissioner years ago here in the city, and I understand the time and the effort that you guys have to put in, so.
Well, and as we're discussing this and bringing up all those points, it's not meant to say, will you do it? We're just talking about in general, so.
Absolutely, and we understand it, and it's the right thing for the community. I think in this instance, again, it's an unusual variance, but it's just the lot lines and the aesthetics for everybody else. And I think one of the things that made us a little unique is most people don't have that many touching lots.
Yeah.
Right? We have a really kind of a weird shaped parcel where it's at, and there's a lot of lots touching it, so.
When are you planning on installing the pool?
We would love to get started in the next couple of weeks, so we're kind of working our way through. We know we're kind of running parallel now on the variance decision with maybe the final council decision on it. If we don't get it, we will proceed with a 5-foot change-up. So we'll comply with the requirements.
We have a permit from HOA and from the city.
Yep.
I have one suggestion for a condition with this variance, and that is a small little sign, if you will, being on the pool cover somewhere that says, to be compliant, this pool cover must always be present, something like that, for the city of Victoria code, something like that. And the reason why I say that is, I think long-term, a future owner needs to know that, that cover is necessary to meet code. Maybe it's one small thing that we can do to ensure that cover is always there, along with.
To have it on the cover?
Yeah, could we have it maybe with where the switch is to open and close it, or somewhere else? Like I say, on the cover is probably
Yeah.
pretty hard for
Yeah,
us
how
to
you do
achieve.
that.
Somewhere, but,
Yeah.
it can be attractive, but, it's not like in your face, but
Right.
somewhere, maybe where the control panel is.
Sure. A sticker or
Along
something.
with our no diving
Yeah.
sign.
Okay. Well, Do you have a question for them, or is this discussion for us?
Just a discussion on it. I would only suggest,
Let's hold our suggestions for 1 second. Thank you for coming out.
All right, thank you, appreciate it.
And now we'll continue. That public, that was just, since they were here for some questions, but we'll discuss this some more. Go ahead.
yeah, I would only suggest that probably as critical an organization, based on my experience that there is the HOA board.
Yeah.
And it's one of those that would side on the extreme for following through. So the HOA, 15 years from now, there's another family there. They would monitor it real closely, and it's a neighborhood group that's taking care of their neighborhood. So, I wouldn't think that there would be any necessity, to kind of define that at the same time. But
Well, and variance is going to follow through. So let me back up 1 second. So as we're discussing, I'm seeing a lot of heads kind of nod up and down. I agree, my head is nodding up and down also, especially when we see the pictures and the fence and how they all come together, especially with that, it's a high-quality fence, that's kind of that wrought iron fencing I'm very familiar with myself also, and that will really stand out if we have that difference, and I think you've came up with a good solution. So I think we're all in favor of granting this variance or recommending it to the city council. But it does sound like we need some conditions on that. I think at a minimum, something along the lines, and somebody can probably craft this better than I can, Marty, about, being fully functional. I mean, the automatic closure system, that it's fully functioning, the barrier itself is replaced and, timely matter. I don't know how you wrap that all together, but, or maybe fully functioning is enough.
Chair, Commissioners, maybe something like a condition of a powered automatic safety cover, a fully functioning powered automatic safety cover, which is maintained to working condition or maintained at working condition, something to that effect.
And closed when the pool is not in use or something, right?
I don't know.
Yeah. Closed when the pool's not being used, closed. And it seems intuitive, but I probably need to spell it out.
Mm-hmm.
What about the sign?
I tend to, I'm certainly not a president of an HOA, but the neighborhoods can be very large, and I tend to think that a president can't manage all the pools in the neighborhood. That's my point. And I'm just trying to do one thing to help make the future pools owned by future owners just easier to manage this variance issue.
Well, I think I think the applicants brought up a good point that we probably need to consider something like this going forward. I reached out to a couple friends I have in California that have pools, and California has a really unique system. They actually have basically 7 safety recommendations. And if you get any 2, thumbs up. And so it gives, in a situation like this where you have some unique settings or fences or whatever, well, maybe I can't do that, but I can do this and meet these safety recommendations. So I think going forward is something that we probably need to consider.
Yeah. Most people in California have a huge privacy wall too, right?
Probably,
Probably like 12 feet or something.
Well, they're reasonable. They're reasonable, alarms on doors, alarms on
Yeah,
pool,
yeah.
On the pool door.
No, I think those are good suggestions.
Yeah, but, so for tonight,
Are any of those conditions listed visually, like on a mechanical system?
no, they didn't have any sign. That was not part of it, like a sign that says anything. It was just different features that you had to meet.
Well, if we're contemplating amending the code, it would be good to then maybe incorporate that as part of that, if we're open to that.
I don't know.
Because somebody'd have to research.
I have sort of mixed feelings about a sign, I guess. I mean, the variance is there and it's going to follow the property
It's
and.
easy to see, right?
I mean, I know, but this,
Small, but,
but it's-
okay, I mean.
that's just my thought. It's
It,
just my-
I know it's still challenging to enforce. I completely
Yeah.
understand that, and I think that issue doesn't go away, so,
I think the only people who are going to see it are the homeowners, and they're going to know.
well, yeah. And so the next owner is like, yeah, God, I don't want to replace the cover next year. Think about it. Maybe they'll just squeak by this year.
Well, I mean, but I'm not sure a sign's going to do anything for that. I mean, that's a concern, that is a valid concern, and, I mean, it's going to, the next owners are going to be made aware of it, and maybe they don't buy that house because it has a pool.
Right. Okay.
Well, when people buy houses with pools, they're doing so because they are very intentional about wanting a pool. I mean, pools actually, from what I understand, decrease the value of a house because you limit the market of people who want to buy that. Not everybody wants a pool, right? So it actually has a counterintuitive effect on the actual property value. So I think the sign is a little burdensome. Maybe I think I agree with the chairman that it's going to be attached to the property, and if it's rotted out or not working, or there's open water, the neighbors who only have a 4-foot high fence, they can see, right? Will hopefully chime in, and the city will have the variance on file. So I think we have a very low-risk situation, in my view, going forward.
Because we know neighbors are pretty good at chiming in. Okay, so I hear sort of a motion coming together with the conditional use. Does anyone want to make a motion?
Can I ask one more quick question? Just by definition, the variance that we provide is not to just the applicants as the owners, but it's the property itself, right? Right, so it's going to travel. Okay, all right.
Yep.
I just one last thing. I am not interested in amending the code. I think that still, in my opinion, it still stays a case by case scenario.
I absolutely agree. I mean, it's something I think we should, if we have more of these, and it's something like we consider, and I mentioned with California doing things, I think there's a lot of states have done a lot of the work for us, and so we can look at some of those moving forward, but I think I agree for right now. I mean, this is one in, I mean, my experience, I guess 3 years up here, I haven't had any of these, so one-offs, absolutely.
Okay, you want a motion?
Sure.
Do I do this right? I move that we approve the variance with the exception that we make explicit that the pool, that the cover on the pool must be maintained and in working conditions at all times.
Just for
Yeah,
clarification
please.
on that, do we want to specify that it should be a powered automatic cover, or do we want to keep that as a just general
No, let's do
cover?
powered automatic pool cover.
Do I need to restate that then?
As long as the chair is fine with that
Is it called a
amendment.
safety cover?
You know what the actual name of it is?
They consider them safety covers, but probably the best definition is.
Marty, is there some sort of occupancy permit that comes with a pool when it's approved to fill with water and now you can start using it? Is there anything like that, or you just put it in? The only reason I ask that question is we may also want to state
Yeah.
that it's on prior to being filled with water or
Right.
whatever, so that it's.
Yeah, I'll have to check with our building official. I don't know if we go out and do post inspection, but I will check with that, check on that, and certainly that would be part of that inspection then at that point in time.
Well, so I would just say part of the provision is just that the pool is, or that the cover is installed immediately. In other words, it's not being installed next summer or the summer after.
Right.
But then and maybe that's implicit, but, or explicit, but. Which is the intention of the applicant.
It is automatic pool cover.
Okay, automatic pool cover.
Okay, do you want to take
They
another
call it
stab at
safety
it?
cover, and we're talking about safety, so to me, it would be good to have it in there, but an automatic safety pool cover. But
So we'll approve the variance with the exception that the
Condition.
condition, sorry, that the pool cover is installed immediately upon usage of the pool, that it be automatic powered pool safety cover.
Staff can make that work if
Okay.
the commission is agreeable to that.
Clean it up, yes. So I have a motion, is there a second?
Second?
I have a second. All in favor, say aye. 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 Opposed, nay. Hearing none, the motion carries. Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Okay. Second discussion item is a public hearing to discuss the Shoreland Management Ordinance. And now, normally, we would hear the staff report first, but in this situation, we are going to hear from a caller.
Do you, Chair, Commission, do you want to officially open the public hearing before we?
Oh, yeah.
take the-
Okay, I will officially now open the public hearing.
Hello, this is John.
Hi, John. This is Alyssa Swanson from the City of Victoria. We have you on call for a public hearing. Is there anything you'd like to address the commission with regarding the Shoreland Ordinance?
Thank you very much. I will be brief in my comments, and let me start by saying that I very much appreciate the accommodation of being able to provide some brief testimony via telephone as opposed to in person. I have submitted a letter and some other educational materials which Mr. Dahl has made part of the record, so I'm not going to repeat that information to you. Let me just very briefly say that I have been a planning consultant in the Twin Cities for over 42 years. I was around when the first DNR model Shoreland Ordinance came out. I assisted multiple communities with the adoption of their initial shoreline ordinances, and I've assisted several of them in updating their ordinances. So that includes both suburban communities and also several around the Brainerd Lakes area, as well as river cities. And my experience has taught me that one size does not fit all. And although there's good reasons for having model ordinances, there are limitations, because even lakes that have enough similarities to be classified the same may be very different in regard to shape and size and context, as well as the nature of the land that surrounds them. And so really the main message that I'm delivering on behalf of my clients, the Meat Cutters Union that owns a parcel on Marsh Lake, is to encourage you to look at ways to provide some flexibility tied to performance in your ordinance. We've submitted, just did a little bit of brief research today and submitted several examples of communities that either through the conditional use permit process or through the planned unit development process gave themselves the discretion to authorize some departures from the strict definition of the tiers for density, et cetera. One of the things about planned unit development is that people tend to think that they're a blank check for a developer, or that they're just sort of, you can do anything you want. And truth of the matter is that planned unit development starts with the underlying standards, and it gives you the authority to vary from those standards, provided that you can determine that there's an advantage in doing so. So looking specifically at the Meat Cutters property, they were willing to dedicate the shoreline to the public. They were willing to look at significant performance guarantees in terms of water quality and landscaping and so forth. But simply because of the shape of the property and the narrowness of the property in some areas and its relationship to right-of-way that the city needed, it was impossible to meet the letter of the law. Again, and just in closing, when the DNR 2017 changes came out, we were assisting a developer in Prior Lake and trying to make it work with the tiers, with the logical idea that density should step back from the water. And what we found with that property was that if we did that, the place where that ordinance would ask us to put all the density was in the middle of mature woods. And if you look at the net benefit or net negative impact on the lake, we were able to demonstrate that that simply was it wasn't the way to go with that property. So we worked closely with Prior Lake. We came up with a plan that that met a reasonable density for the developer, and also included in the planned unit development conditions of approval that were recorded, that were enforceable, and had performance guarantees to make sure that they happened. So again, there's a number of different ways in which the city could go. I'm not in a position tonight to recommend one way or the other. I would just encourage you to be open to the idea of giving the city that discretion. Happy to answer any questions, and again, thank you very much for the opportunity to address you via telephone.
Any questions? At this time, we have no questions.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. So the public hearing is open. Do we have any other guests?
Chair, Commissioners, my name is Jacob Steen with Larkin Hoffman Attorneys, and we represent the Marsh Lake Hunt Club. As you know, the Hunt Club owns a large tract of land south and east of Marsh Lake Road. The Hunt Club, of course, has been operated as a hunting preserve for several years. They have no intention of ever doing anything other than a hunting preserve. But we feel it's important to provide some comments on this ordinance because under the orderly annexation agreement, the hunting club property will eventually become part of the city of Victoria. And for those reasons, every time you adopt an ordinance, it does have an impact on the use of their land. I have really three comments that I have tried to outline in a letter that should be part of your packet. They largely deal with deviations from the DNR model ordinance. The first deviation is regarding the clear cutting and intensive vegetation clearing definition. Of course, the DNR model ordinance prohibits clear cutting, which under the model ordinance is defined as the complete removal of trees and shrubs. In the draft ordinance, the city removed complete from that definition, which left the definition wholly ambiguous and open to misinterpretation. So for those reasons, we would strongly encourage you to add that language back in. Obviously, any tree removal in the city is going to be subject to the tree preservation ordinance, which I'll get to in just a moment. But this is really intended to capture one very specific type of removal. So I'd encourage you to add that language back in so as to clear up any ambiguity. The second deviation I want to point out and propose you revert back to the DNR model ordinance is regarding what the city is tentatively calling in this ordinance undeveloped natural environment lake. And specifically looking at the riparian lot minimum or minimum lot area and minimum lot width. And the club strongly opposes any deviation upwards from those minimum. There's really no rational basis to do so, and you would be really setting yourself apart as a city from all of the surrounding communities because nobody else has similar minimums that deviate in that way. And that's specifically moving from 40,000 square feet minimum lot area to 43,560, which I believe is actually the current lot area minimum, and then also from 125 to 150, whereas the model ordinance is 125. So we would encourage you to revert back to the DNR model ordinance at a minimum. And then lastly is really just a comment. The model ordinance does contemplate forest conservation or forest land conversion, where you would be converting heavily wooded forest areas adjacent to lakes, and we do feel like that is something that may impact the Hunt Club. Now, of course, the city has stricken that language because you already have a pretty thorough tree preservation ordinance. However, we have, as you may Some of you may recall, last year we strongly opposed the most recent updates to the tree preservation ordinance, which imposed some pretty substantial and we believe fairly arbitrary restrictions on clearing of wooded steep slopes. So I do understand that that is on your work plan and will probably be coming up in the next year. So as you look at this ordinance, we'd strongly encourage that you consider what those changes are going to be in the future so as to impose minimum reasonable standards. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any
Thank you.
questions? I don't see any. Thank you. Any other public comments? I don't see any. So can I have a motion to close the public hearing?
So moved.
Can I have a second? Second. I have a motion and a second. All in favor of closing the public hearing, say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Hearing none, motion carries. Public hearing is closed. And now, Marty, we will have the staff presentation.
Yes, thank you, Chair, Commissioners. So as you mentioned, we did want to do this a little bit differently. Typically, we would give our staff presentation prior to public hearing, but because we are not necessarily looking to approve or recommend approval of a specific ordinance tonight, and we've got future meetings, and we do have a long presentation again to kind of work through some of those issues that we've discussed. We wanted to allow the public that was interested in providing feedback to do so, and we'll get into our presentation now. So as I mentioned, we're not asking at this meeting for any specific recommendation. We're still kind of in that discussion and revision phase. We wanted to build in some timeline to accept that public feedback so it can be part of our ongoing discussion. So just kind of an update as to where we are in the process. As you know, we have had several meetings and several revisions to the DNR model ordinance in our red line version that has come before this body as well as the Lakes and Water Quality Committee. And we have now received some initial DNR feedback. For those of you that happen to watch or listen to the Lakes and Water Quality Committee meeting last Thursday, we did get some of that feedback prior to that meeting, so some of that was presented for the first time there, but we'll be going over that for this body as well as the feedback from the Lakes and Water Quality Committee. So as I mentioned, we've already conducted the public hearing. And you've accepted the feedback and testimony, so we're going to continue to discuss the highlights of the current red line ordinance and the DNR feedback, as well as if the commission wants to have any discussion based on any of the public feedback you have received. So this list probably looks pretty familiar. These are the areas that I think we are getting closer to trying to figure out where we want to land, but these will be the areas that we will be discussing again this evening. So with that, the first thing I want to call out is the definitions section in the ordinance. So as we mentioned in earlier meetings, we have, for the most part, with some caveats, used the DNR's model language, or in instances where the city already had a general definition in its ordinance, we tried to bring that definition over into the Shoreland ordinance so that there wasn't conflicting definitions for the same thing. Building height is one of those, and this is new to the list of things to discuss just because based on some of the DNR feedback we received. So the definition you see up on the screen, the vertical distance between the ground elevation abutting a building and the midpoint elevation of the highest gable of a pitched or hipped roof, that is our current standard zoning definition, and we did get some DNR feedback requesting or asking how the height is going to be measured for buildings on a slope within a shoreland. And that one of the purposes of their rules is to regulate the height to limit views of buildings from the water. Again, there is a DNR definition as to how we measure, how they propose to measure building height, which includes some graphics. I think staff's intention was for simplification to try and keep those definitions the same between all of the code, but I don't think that precludes if the commission feels this is an important thing to make sure that that is measured that way to be able to revert that to the DNR language. And Chair, would you like me to stop in between each of these different items for discussion, or would you like me to move through and just, if you guys have things to speak to jump in?
Yeah, how about we'll take it on ourselves to jump in.
Okay.
If you don't hear the jump in, there's a jump.
Doesn't midpoint elevation mean the midpoint of, say, a hill or a slope or something of that? I mean, I feel like you answered the question.
Right. Yeah, it is. So they've got a specific, the DNR has a specific, you'll see in your red line ordinance that's included. They've got a graphic that kind of shows what they're talking about and where those measurements are taken from, and it is a little different than what our current ordinance says or how we would measure from there.
Which one allows for a higher height? Because a lot of the lakes do slope down off a fairly large hill or whatever.
And I'd say the midpoint elevation would be in the middle of wherever that house happens to be, go up 3 stories or 2.5 or
I just
35
wanted
feet or
to
whatever.
compare their rules against
Right.
our rules
Yeah.
on some examples. What's the difference? We're talking a foot? Are we talking
Right.
10 feet? What are we talking? You almost would have to go through some scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
Is there language that has actual height, like heights? Because I think having a basis to start from is always helpful.
Yeah, so I can tell you what the existing DNR definition is. So the DNR's definition is the vertical distance between the highest adjoining ground level at the building or 10 feet above the lowest adjoining ground level, whichever is lower, and the highest point of a flat roof or average height of the highest gable of a pitched or hipped roof. So that is how the DNR is trying to accommodate for those instances where you have that slope and the face of the home is facing the water. So they're providing specific points to measure from. All right, I will move on to the next one. Just again, something for us to consider as we move forward. Another item that is on the definitions list, this is one that you have seen before, is our definition of impervious surface or lot coverage. There are actually 2 pieces of DNR feedback that are related to this impervious surface definition. So in the current definition that we have included, we are saying lot coverage shall not include, and then a list of things including permeable walkways and permeable patios. So the DNR had asked, saying they're okay with that, but they would like to see some specific definition of permeable walkways and patios because they have seen some of these be used to extremes. And I've got some potential example here as we move forward a few slides of to what that could look like. And then the other question that we received is how does the city rationalize excluding swimming pools from impervious surface? That is something that I have inherited coming here, so I'm not exactly sure how that originally was included as an exception to the impervious surface. I think there's some different trains of thought on that, but to the DNR's point is that it doesn't technically allow filtration. I will state for the commission's benefit that if the city were to change course not only in Shoreland but in other areas and begin counting a swimming pool as an impervious surface versus pervious, we would have a lot of legal non-conforming swimming pools in the city because a lot of times those being the exception allows them to take place in areas where that surface is maxed out. So related to patio, one of the notes from the DNR was a question about how the city would treat a patio that's made out of decking that's over 3 feet above the ground. And that question stems from our city code definition, says that a deck is attached to the house. So we're trying to define what if you've got something that's not attached to the house, whether that be a deck or a patio or stone. So we had created this definition for patio, which we have since, in this example, amended to answer the DNR's feedback that if that patio would be made of decking and larger than 3 feet above the ground, that it would have to meet the same setbacks of the principal structure as a regular attached deck would. So we've administratively addressed that question, but wanted to bring it to the attention of the commission as well. And then also the question of, related to permeable patios and permeable walkways. We did take a stab based on some research that we did to try and find some comparable definitions in other areas as to how one may consider defining a permeable patio or walkway, which would not count against those impervious surface standards. So again, this is by no means meant to be the final definition, but it is some sample language that we, kind of a hodgepodge of things that seem to be relevant that we pulled together, relating that it's a patio or a walkway designed to facilitate infiltration of water into the soil, that it must be constructed in a way that allows water to channel or absorb into the underlying soil or into a special storage layer and not create runoff, and then some specific conditions related to being installed to industry standards as a permeable surface, that there are appropriate soil and site conditions, be constructed of a grid of pavers or stones with voids or spaces, have an effective sublayer, and then also one of the questions from the DNR was how would you limit that, or what would you consider for size? And as we discussed this with the Lakes and Water Quality Committee, their feedback was to seek some guidance from the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District on what that size or percentage standard is. There was a lot of discussion on should that be a set size, should that be a percentage of the entire lot. So if you've got a bigger lot, you can maybe make a little bit bigger pervious surface, as opposed to in a smaller lot. So we have not yet reached out to the watershed district, but that was the Lakes and Water Quality feedback on that item. This next definition, steep slopes, one of the items that Mr. Steen referred to. So this is another one of those definitions that had been revised prior to my arrival here. So I'm not entirely sure of all of the history and the decision making that went behind creating that definition. But we do have a somewhat unique and very thorough, I guess I would say, definition of steep slope, relating to those being slopes of 18% or steeper, and with an elevation change of at least 10 feet, and then some information of how those are measured from the toe to the top. The DNR feedback we relieved specifically about this one is that this provision, their provision for steep slopes, which counts a 12% or steeper grade as a steep slope, their indication that that is already a not very strong provision to begin with, and that they have some concern with relaxing that percent for steep slopes as it further weakens the standards. So that is one I'd actually, for my own personal benefit, for those of you on the Planning Commission, if you have any historical insight on any of the steep slope discussion that went on and some of the rationale as we continue to work with the DNR on why and how we have these things in place.
Well, I was here. And it seemed, it was your predecessors. It was kind of it was a point for him, and it passed. It passed the city council, and I have to admit, I kind of scratched my head after that. I think it does put not only a place like the Marsh Lake Hunt Club, but I think it does put a lot of, as we expand and annex, I think it could create a lot of hardship for some of those landowners. So I'm not sure, it might be something we may need to revisit.
I'm very open to revisiting it. I struggled with it back then as well. I mean, especially with new development, I just question, even though there might be steep slope there, who's to say if your property owner doesn't have the wherewithal and vision to grade it and make it great,
Right. And it kind of goes back to the first caller, not everything's, it all doesn't match up. It's not all cookie cutter. They're all unique. And, I think that it's worth looking at.
And this may be an opportunity to change or adjust that definition as well, because if we determine that in the Shoreland district, we want to amend the definition of that. There are some other definitions that by DNR's request, we've been asked to amend what our general definition is that are minor, but make sense to then adjust our general definitions. This would potentially be an opportunity. So I can add that to the list for our next meeting to maybe look into that in a little more detail.
Yeah, I think that'd be a good idea.
Really understand its application, is
Right.
very helpful.
We had a meeting a couple times ago, and I think, Scott, I don't think you were there. Laura was leading us, and the city folks presented different options and how we compared to other cities. And the question kind of came up with the Lakes Committee, and we just didn't get a chance to answer it. But on the new stuff that we annexed, it would seem like being closer to the DNR model would be advantageous. So it just seems like to me, anytime we have an opportunity to align ourselves a little bit more closely with the DNR, that might be in our best interest.
Yeah, I think that, in my experience with when we're meeting with the Lakes and Water Quality Group, I mean, it's a strong group, and they have their ideas and opinions, and I respect those.
Yep.
But it is one side, and we still have to.
They're super knowledgeable, they're passionate.
Without a doubt.
But they all probably live on one of the lakes, and we basically are saying, hey, we're not going to change the standards for the existing.
Right.
That we would flex the standards just for the new to be more closely aligned with the DNR, because you really can't undo the dynamics of what already exists on some of the existing lakes, right? So it'd be tough to do.
Yeah.
It'd be unfair to do.
Did you raise your hand, Mr. Brownlee? Okay. Any other comments on it? Okay.
We'll plan to bring some additional information on steep slopes back to the next meeting.
Thanks, Marty.
So that kind of gets through our definitions section. I know Mr. Steen had brought up the question about the clear cutting definition. So if that's something the commission would like to discuss as well as, or if there are any other definitions that we didn't highlight as part of this presentation that you'd like to discuss before I move on.
Well, when I see it, it's amazing how one word can really change things, and it absolutely changes that completely. And I think that's something we might, I agree also, I think it's something we need to consider. Any thoughts?
All right. Anything else with definitions before I move on?
I think that's it.
All right, so the next item, nonconformities. So as you'll recall in our previous discussions, this is currently a flexibility request from the DNR model ordinance due to this being existing language in this current City of Victoria's code, where there's actually two different pieces of these nonconformities that I'll review again just so we all remember what we're talking about. But in our previous discussions, when we talked about this at a little bit higher level, it sounded like there was a consensus of the Planning Commission that we still wanted to be able to provide some flexibility in these situations for nonconformities. So we have included that language in there, and we have gotten some additional DNR feedback. But just again, just to highlight, so the first section of it speaks to addition or expansions to the outside dimensions of an existing non-conforming structure may be permitted without a variance provided that they meet these following standards. You'll notice the addition of the outside of the shore impact zone. That again was one of the administrative changes that we've redlined in prior to this meeting based on DNR feedback, being they think that they could be behind this flexibility, but they did not think it was appropriate in the shore impact zone. The shore impact zone is 50% of the building line setback. So for example, on a natural environment lake, which would have 150-foot building setback, if you're already non-conforming beyond, if you're closer than 75 feet, the DNR is saying we don't want to allow any additional expansion, but you could have some flexibility as long as you're outside of that impact zone. And then, as I said, DNR has said they're open to this idea, but would like to see some offsetting higher standards, potentially requiring restoration of riparian vegetation to an established riparian buffer if we were to allow these types of enhancements and nonconformities. And then we've got some good lakes and water quality feedback that I'll come up to next, but the other piece of the nonconformities has to do with lots of record that are nonconforming that are essentially tear down. So right now, our code does allow some flexibility and ability to have a nonconforming home, be able to tear it down or down to the studs and be able to rebuild in that non-conforming location. It does have a calculation related to, depending on your non-conformity, that reduces your height and it reduces your side setbacks and that sort of thing to try to minimize the impact of that building. So the DNR, again, had noted that they are open to considering that sort of flexibility with those offsetting standards. Specifically for this one, they had indicated that it seemed like limiting the height of 25 feet for any structure not meeting the required setback seemed appropriate. They had indicated, because we had some discussion about the permeable pavement and patios and walkways, that in these specific instances, permeable pavement should not be allowed, specifically for driveways, to be able to try to work around the impervious surface standards. And then they did raise a question, which I think is the policy question for the commission to discuss, is if this is about tear downs and rebuilding larger structures that are non-conforming, why do we want to continue to allow that essentially new structure when it is physically possible to meet setback standards? And before I turn this one back over to the commission to talk about a little bit, so the lakes and water quality feedback on this item, again, they indicated they were supportive of allowing this type of flexibility with offsetting protective standards, but they didn't necessarily want to limit it just to shoreland restoration. They had suggested potentially providing an example of different offsetting protections, so whether that's related to some sort of drainage improvement or something else, some other items that would improve the protective nature of those things, versus just saying it has to specifically be shoreland restoration. And then there was also a discussion on whether those types of things should be allowed with a conditional use permit, so that there can be some sort of standard put in place to make sure that maintains those protective standards. And then they also agreed with the DNR feedback that setting a height limit of 25 feet specifically on the lakeside seemed to be appropriate in those situations. So I'll pause on this one to allow the commission to discuss or ask questions.
Can you flip back one?
Yep.
So, just going to tell us the tear down.
I know I was pretty fast.
So, just so I understand this right, so like, let's look at the tear down for a second. So if it's non-conforming, we tear it down, we're going to build a new home there. That's where that 25-foot limit would take effect on that. So we're sort of limiting the McMansions on a lake shore.
And our current ordinance, if we go back one more slide, actually has some additional requirements that limit the size of that. So the side yard setbacks are increased by every 1 foot that the structure encroaches towards the water, so it shrinks your side footprint. And then again, we have the maximum building and structure height is reduced by 1/4 of a foot for every foot, but there's no maximum beyond what our current building height maximum of 35 feet is. So I think what the commission and the DNR had suggested is that in addition to that, you maybe set a height maximum that regardless of the calculation, it can't go over that 25 feet or whatever the number ends up being.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's reasonable. I mean, I picture, as we expand, we're going to run into some of these homes that potentially are cabins, basically, could potentially be in families for years, run down, and maybe finally some grandkids or even great grandkids have an opportunity to build a nicer house on that location. Tear downs aren't always extravagant. We're just going to make it safe and livable, and put that 25-foot limit on it seems reasonable.
On the flip side, if you're putting many parcels together and you have, I don't know, call it an acre and a half, let's just say you're really lucky you're able to put that much together. And then you want a really large home on that much land. I hate to limit someone for that. If they really want to have a huge house
Well, we're talking about non-conforming here, though. I mean, so if it's,
Okay.
it's within, it's too close.
Okay, so in that context, we're.
Okay. But I mean, I agree with your point. I mean, if it's a larger lot and it's conforming, we're just gonna have our set standards that we have. Anybody else? Thoughts?
I think the strange part about it is the current standard is tougher than what we're looking to implement for the new development areas. How many non-conforming properties are there right now that would be and have the opportunity to be grandfathered in to be non-conforming again? I mean, 3, 5,
You know,
20?
and this was something else that came up with the Lakes and Water Quality Committee meeting last week, is we have not done an inventory. It would take a little bit of legwork, but I think it's something even based on just doing a GIS review and kind of looking at some of these lakeshore lots, we likely could try to get a rough estimate as to how many of these types of structures exist. I think, and I'm saying I think because I have not looked into this very closely, but I think that if you are going to find a nonconformity, it's most likely that water line setback, because when those homes were originally built, you didn't have those stringent of standards, so homes are closer to the lake. But that is something the Lakes and Water Quality Committee had discussed as well, is that it might be helpful just to at least get a sense of how many properties are we talking about that actually fall into this, that are beyond those current setbacks.
It's kind of similar to that map you put in the packet for this week, where you did the expanded view of the different types of lakes, you know, within 2 miles of us. Maybe this sort of similar thing, looking at areas where annexation is likely.
And I believe we do have some of these in our current existing city limits too. Some of those older lake homes, I think we're going to find some examples of them not meeting those current setbacks. So I think it is something that is out there. We're just not sure to the extent how much.
I think they said there's not that many.
I would think there's too many.
I mean, access, there's limited access in a lot of these lakes that are developed.
And the other piece to this is that when you're talking a tear down, it does require a variance. So we've got some guidance to guide the commission and the council on trying to approve yay or nay a variance, but it does require a variance. So any time that situation comes up, it's going to come before this body. We're going to have discussion like this. You're going to be able to review it. All right. One of the other questions, so moving on to land use, when we had our last joint meeting with the Lakes and Water Quality Committee, was whether or not mining and the expansion of agricultural feedlots could be considered a non-allowed use. So that was something that we did reach out to the DNR and ask specifically about. And the indication that we got is that, yes, we can make those non-allowed uses. So if they're not allowed in the zoning district anyway, there's no reason they need to. They have to be allowed within a shoreline district. And then same with the expansions of feedlots, that the city would have the ability, if the city chooses, to say that you cannot expand your, if you've got an agricultural use, which would not come into play with anything that we currently have within our city limits, but potentially in the future, if the city were to try to seek any planning and zoning authority for any areas prior to annexation, that potentially could become an item. But within our current city limits, I'm unaware of any feedlots that would expand within the current city of Victoria limits. But the answer from the DNR was yes, we can make those non-allowed use. So from the LQAC, they were supportive of, guess what, I copy and pasted that slide. That's from the previous. Ignore that. The LQAC was supportive of making those non-allowed uses. So lot area and width standards. So this is one that we've spent a lot of time on, as you'll recall, and this is to Commissioner Schwarting's point, the items about where the current red line sits, where we have our developed and undeveloped lakes basically within city limits and outside of city limits. So we did have a brief workshop kind of overview with the city council at their previous meeting, just to give them an update of where we are at in the status of this. And there was some concern expressed over having those different standards between within the city and without the city. There was, discussion, at least from a majority of those that were there that evening, that they would like to see consistency among those two different standards. So we did take that feedback, and that was something we brought to the Lakes and Water Quality Committee as well to discuss. And so as part of our discussion last week on this item, the committee had a consensus that if the city council wants consistency and wants them to be the same, their preference is that everything be the Victoria higher standard than what we have with our current lakes today. However, there wasn't a consensus if the council were to consider the kind of the direction we're headed towards right now, where we are looking to classify within city limits and with the outside of city limits differently. It was probably a pretty close split. There were about half of the committee members say that, yeah, they would be supportive of having those DNR standards on those outside of city limit lakes, the future developed lakes. While half of them would prefer regardless to see those higher standards put in place. So again, there was no consensus of the group. There was kind of a split of opinion. And then some other items that were discussed but did not, certainly by no means had a consensus of the group, but that were throwing out some feedback that seemed relevant. There was some concern over the impacts on existing lots of record on what we're currently defining as those undeveloped lakes. So Pearson's, for example, there are homes and developments and areas around Pearson. So there was some question about if we were to create, put in the DNR standards, does that have an impact, and how different is that from what is currently in use there? Similar to the concerns of those that live on the lakes currently in Victoria. One of the ideas or things that was thrown out there was that if the council was looking to be consistent, and if the commission and council wanted to consider using the DNR standards, that potentially you could preclude any minor subdivisions on any of the existing city lakes, so you could avoid the problem which we discussed last meeting, was the potential for the lot splits on especially those recreational development lakes if you went from the acre to the half-acre standard from the DNR. So that was one idea, that if we wanted to do that, you potentially use the DNR standards, but you put in some provisions that don't allow those lot splits on some of those existing lakes, lots of record. There was a question or a comment about, should we really be defining these lakes just solely based on whether in city limits or outside of city limits, or should there be some other sort of calculation based on percentage of the lake that's actually developed? And again, I think that's most relevant for like Pearson's Lake, which has some residential homes on it now. And then there was also a suggestion, perhaps you consider a middle ground standard for all lake classifications that's somewhere between the DNR minimums and the current Victoria standards. So I think this one I will also toss back to the commission to talk. I do have the tables you referenced, so we can click through those with the lot area and the lot widths that we can click through as well.
Thoughts as we're going through these?
I'm not going to agree with the council. I agree with you that, here I am looking at the recreational development. If we were to follow this, then the current Shoreland district, we would have an acre lot, no smaller than an acre. I feel this, I certainly think that's too much. I just think that's too much. 20,000 square feet, perhaps that's on the small side. And maybe we look at something different, but I do think that we love our lakes here, and if there's an opportunity for more people to be on the lake, then so be it. And I mean, I think there's a lot of land, and many people don't want that much land today. So, I mean, it'd be one thing if we had a lot of lakes in our community. We don't. I mean, we have only so many lakes that can be built on here, and so what's the right number? You know, that's the magic question. So that's recreational development lake, general development lake. I mean, I guess this is a collective conversation, but that is the one that stands out the most to me. Is the recreational development lake. So I think we really have to look at that.
Well, I think, when you said, what is right, that's hard to determine. But the DNR in our state of lakes has done a lot of research on that. And, I think, I think consistency is good. I think the DNR is good. And I think to me, it makes sense to be consistent with that.
That's certainly been my observation. At the same time, I've followed the reasonableness that I would view as reasonableness with the DNR standards, and it's there, and that's why I have no problem subscribing to the DNR standards on this. At the same time, and I think you're right, Laura, on the size. That's that kind of eliminates an awful lot of potential options. So.
If I'm not hearing anything else, it sounds like it might be a
Yeah,
consensus.
no, I support the DNR and did previously. And sometimes I wonder if we just wanted to keep the Victoria standards, we could have saved ourselves a lot of time. So, why did we embark on this? Right?
I thought the same thing today as I was reading through it. I'm like,
this has been a lot of time. So it's
how
like,
did it
why?
start? I mean, it was before me, obviously. How did it start?
It started before me, too. It stems from the DNR's updated model ordinance, which came out in 2017. So I think that cities were encouraged to look at that and try to adopt something. So I believe that's how the process began back 2-3 years ago.
And you see many of our sister communities did move to the DNR model, right?
So just a question for the commission. So am I hearing that the commission would like to see the DNR model standards across the board, or are we still interested in pursuing that somewhat split or deviation where we are maintaining standards on the existing lakes and looking to those lakes that are yet to be fully developed to have the DNR standards?
Does the city council have the opportunity to veto us on this?
On an ordinance, that's a good question. So I believe the city council can amend an ordinance, right? So if a ordinance is brought to them and is presented to them, I think they have the prerogative to make changes to that prior to approval. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I guess how do you protect anybody who's a homeowner on one of the lakes if we adopt the DNR standards? Is anybody at risk of having economic pain? I guess that's what I think we struggled with a little bit in our one call.
And just to be perfectly frank with the commission, and you are all aware just based on our discussions, there are a lot of passionate people out there that would be very much opposed to lowering any of the standards. That's not to say that it's not the right thing or that we can't do it, but there would be, there's a lot of people, including some of our advisory committee members, who would be very much opposed to that.
think, does the city council know that one of the reasons we were talking about grandfather clauses is because of the passionate people in their existing places? I mean, we want to make sure that we maintain the level of property that they have today and what they purchased versus everybody starts cutting it up and selling places off, and now you have 6 houses and 1 property, and what's that going to do to lake quality? It's still within the DNR standards, but, so I think that as long as they realize that, that's why there's 2 different standards.
And I will also say, and I typically try to remain as neutral on these items as possible. What I would say from a staff perspective, I feel like the having those different standards between the developed and the undeveloped is a good compromise. It allows the character and being able to maintain what's happening currently within Victoria to continue, and it's unique. It's a unique situation, and it won't allow that character to change drastically. Whereas in some of those areas, as the city grows, you are now providing some additional opportunity then to not necessarily have as stringent of standards. So let me ask this question. If the council were to consider not saying everything has to be the same, would it be the intention of the commission that we'd still like to try to pursue that separation between existing and undeveloped and developed lakes?
I think so, and I think you brought up a good point. I mean, as long as they understand the basis of where we're coming from and the intent, I think it, I hope that they clearly understand that.
Okay. That's good feedback. And just as long as we are talking about this, another one of the items that Mr. Steen brought up this evening was the in the undeveloped lake area, the difference from the DNR standards when it as far as natural environment riparian lakes when it comes to lot area and lot width. I think part of the intention of maintaining those higher standards, at least initially when this project kicked off, was that we were looking at that as a potential offset standard because we were looking to try to have some flexibility with those non-riparian lots in those areas on natural environment lakes to be able to go down from the DNR standard of 20,000 to 15 and from the DNR standard on width down to 80. So I believe that's the intention of why the riparian lots were a little bit higher, because it was looked to say, here's kind of the compromise, right? We're going to have a higher standard on those shoreline lots, but we're going to be able to, or we're going to allow additional density on those that are not necessarily right on the shoreline. All right, any additional thoughts, feedback? All right. This was another fun conversation on Thursday. A lot of good input related to controlled access lots. So as you'll recall, I think the commission as well as the committee is in favor of allowing these types of lots as a conditional use with development. So if a developer would like to create a controlled access lot for non-riparian owners, everybody seems to be in favor of allowing that flexibility. The question came in the DNR's language related to docking, mooring, and overwater storage. So the DNR essentially says that it needs to be the same lot area, lot width is what a residential lot would be, and that they would allow up to 6 watercraft to be moored on a dock on that controlled access lot. And then it actually provides flexibility that you can moor additional boats but then you have to exponentially have that lot be larger to be able to accommodate that. So we talked about this for a while last Thursday, and some of the Lakes and Water Quality Committee feedback that we received was that our current city code allows for only 1 dock and slip per property. So it's our waterways section, I believe. that requires that. However, we did learn in that meeting that we do have several non-conforming association docks presently that have anywhere between 4 and 10 slips, including on Zumbra and Virginia Lake. So most likely those are legal non-conforming, that they were in place prior to that one dock property, but we do have some non-conforming association lots or controlled access lots currently. So there was some difference of opinion as to what is appropriate for these types of developments, because we do have some in place. So as I mentioned, there was not necessarily a consensus on that, on how many docks and slips should be allowed. The opinions ranged from the 6 as the DNR model ordinance to maybe do you split it down the middle and do you say 3 instead of 6, to the 1, like similar to the Waterford, where there's allowed to be 1 boat slip there. And the primary concern related to allowing too many boats was related to increased boat traffic and water safety on those somewhat smaller lakes. So again, we did not reach a consensus in that meeting, but there was definitely a number of different opinions on what seemed appropriate in those types of situations.
Can we go back to the previous slide for 1 second?
Sure.
The thing that's kind of odd to me is that there's no, so we have 6 watercrafts as our basis, but we don't have a land area in connection with it.
It does, so the lot must meet the area and width requirements for residential lots, so the bullet right above that. So it's saying that, so depending on what the lot area and width ends up being, most likely these are going to come from out of a PUD, so it may deviate from what the standard requirements are. So whatever it's determined that this is the minimum lot width and the minimum lot area, that's the controlled access lot would have to be at least that big. It could be larger, but it would need to be at least as large as the residential lot.
Yeah, that's kind of, until you 6, 5, 4, 3, until you work with them, see what the development's going to be, it's kind of hard to cookie cutter that one also.
Mm-hmm. And again, I think the way the DNR language is written is that, again, this would be a conditional use, so it would be something that would be discussed.
Right.
And that, they could allow up to 6, but there's also flexibility. There was, as we discussed that specific point, there was some conversation about that if the ordinance gives that number of 6, that most likely that's going to be the starting point on a lot of these. So it's going to be hard to say, no, you can't have that many, or it'll be a more difficult conversation, I would say, or discussion. Whereas if that number were to be lower from the onset and allow some flexibility upward. But again, there was not consensus on that.
Have you looked at all at, just as sort of a aside, the cove in Halstead Bay on Lake Minnetonka? St. Bonnie, it's either St. Bonnie or Minnetrista.
I think it's Minnetrista. Is it Minnetrista?
It's right. It's under the Minnetrista.
It's actually water tower.
It's actually an Excelsior zip code, I know, but they have this situation, and definitely multiple moorings, docks, and it's a mix of personal docks for homes on the lake, but then there's a bunch of homes off the lake that have it. It's a nice development, and I've tried to find the code and things for them, and I haven't been able to. It might be interesting if you can dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, and we did, and I believe I included it in the background packet. So during our joint session, we had talked about doing some comparison on what some of the other dock regulations are in some of these other areas. So we did pull, and I'm hoping now I'm second guessing myself that I actually included it in your packet.
I think you did.
I know it was in the Lakes and Water Quality packet, but just a snapshot of some of the other areas that seemed like a apples to apples type comparison for these types of things. So we did look into the Lake Minnetonka Conservation District and what they allow. So they do have some requirements related to shoreline and the length of the dock that goes out, but I believe their minimum before you start needing to do additional permitting and items is 5, if I'm recalling correctly. So I think they're at 5 boats moored. Let me see if I can find that specifically. Sorry, bear with me. Yeah, I'm not finding it right off the top of my head, putting myself on the spot, but I believe it's 5. We also found some information from Minnetrista, which actually encourages multiple and joint docks. They actually have a multiple and joint dock policy where they're encouraging more of the clustering versus the individual docks. And then they do have some language and requirements as it relates to these controlled access lots. And then Prior Lake was another one where we found some additional information. So they allow mooring facilities on their general development lake. So they do have a kind of difference between the lakes. Obviously, they're larger lakes. They're allowing it, and by conditional use permit. And they also are 5 slips on a controlled access lot. So that was some of the comparable data we pulled together on a quick search. So is there any direction from the commission as we continue to revise? Do we want to stick with what the DNR's got? Do we want to do something different? And what is redline today does not necessarily have to be what's redline in stone, but it helps as we continue to progress through.
I mean, I sort of like the DNR mode, especially if, it's all conditional use and it's going to come before us anyways. I mean, it's kind of a catch-all.
Right. I'm seeing some head nods and I'm not seeing any head shakes, so I'll take that.
Yeah, well, they put an incredible amount of research and an incredible amount of study into what they're doing. And from my standpoint, it seems very logical at the same time, which is rather unusual.
Careful, they could be watching. I think it's right in line with the DNR.
All right.
I'm thinking cautious again. As you were talking, I looked up Bay Cliff and I counted 9 docks. I couldn't tell how wide and big of an area that was, but I know that the riparian lots have access to other docks up there. So you have a non-conformity right off the bat. But again, that's Google Maps. I don't know how accurate that is, and that could be, there might only be 3 of it just tripled out from the
Right.
satellite view. But
And
a point of caution again.
And as I mentioned, we do currently have those uses that allow the multiple docks. They're non-conforming presently, but we do have them out there. Placement, height, and design standards. So again, this is related to our previous conversation on the width and area. This is just for that ordinary high water line setback. Having that flexibility. We did also have a question, as you'll recall from our joint session, is whether or not the DNR has any restrictions on wells from the ordinary high water line, and the answer was no, the DNR doesn't, but the Minnesota Department of Health does regulate setbacks from wells, from water, and those sorts of things. So it's not necessarily something that would need to be in our ordinance, as it would be dictated by MDH when those wells are put in or homes are built. And this, again, is just that snapshot showing what we're looking at, and really the only potential flexibility or potential change would be the setback for those recreational development lakes if we were to do that split approach between developed and undeveloped. All right, this one should be a quick and easy one. Water-oriented accessory structures. So I believe the intention of the commission, the last time we talked about this, was to not pursue looking at water or sewer in those water-oriented accessory structures, but the Lakes and Water Quality Committee wanted to look into that a little more. Their consensus was they no longer wish to pursue that. So I think everybody's on the same page with that as well. Vegetation management. So this was one that we didn't necessarily have any specific DNR feedback or things that we needed to highlight, but we had gotten a lot of feedback from the Lakes and Water Quality Committee related to ensuring that those vegetation and protective shoreline protection standards were up to snuff. So we brought that up just as a general item of discussion and looked to see if those requirements were adequate. From their point of view and some of the feedback we received is that there is a desire to enhance some of the standards on how to install and maintain vegetative buffers, particularly when in a PUD. So as you'll recall, and as we'll get to in just a second, there are some requirements if going to a PUD for some shoreline protection. So they're looking to say, is there anything that we can actually create a standard on what does that mean, or at least a minimum standard of what does that mean, instead of being less ambiguous. There was a question about whether or not we should include some additional standards for erosion control. Specifically, the discussion was around items along the shoreline like buckthorn, which I think everybody was in agreement that we don't like buckthorn, we want to get rid of buckthorn, but sometimes if you remove a lot of that vegetation, even if it's bad vegetation, it can have some impacts on shoreline stability, and should there be some sort of requirement that encourages the buckthorn removal but says you need to do XYZ to make sure that there's no erosion impacts from that removal. And then there was also just a note again to reference the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District as the permitting body for riprap, because that is what's currently in place. So I think again that's a small administrative item in that ordinance. Stormwater management. So I'm looking at this from the lens of our discussion on the Central Business District and some of the items that we were discussing about how to maintain that flexibility on being able to do what we need to do when it comes to development. And you've probably seen, if you reviewed the red line ordinance and some of the DNR feedback, you know, we tried to include some definitions and a section, and the DNR essentially said, if you include your impervious surface standards of what you have now, we can probably just handle it that way. The DNR has been very flexible in other agencies that have existing business districts within a shoreland, that they've kind of said, all right, you can do what you need to do there. So their recommendation was you don't even need to speak to it specifically in the ordinance. If we've got a impervious surface coverage that again they appear to be willing to accept what our current ordinance is of 80% maximum, that will govern that, and we would handle any development within here as we would any other commercial type development, not necessarily specific to shoreline. Just some additional lakes and water feedback on that item. They did want to ensure that we have strong stormwater management guidelines in place related to that, just so that even though we do have some flexibility in how and what we're allowing for development, to have some strong standards as to how to manage stormwater when it comes to those types of developments. And then this is this one is probably a question that goes beyond the shoreland ordinance, but something that we've talked about before is that ongoing maintenance and responsibility for stormwater ponds. That it's my understanding is that it's kind of switched over the years. Sometimes it's been the city's responsibility. Sometimes they've left it up to the homeowners associations, and then a lot of times when they do need maintenance, the HOAs aren't necessarily ready for the expense or the cost, and so then it comes back to the city. But it's an important thing, and as I mentioned, the Lakes and Water Quality Committee, it's something we're discussing internally as to how do we better manage and maintain and make sure we're prepared for the maintenance of those types of ponds.
Yeah, I think it falls into the Central Business District also. I think whatever happens there, there's going to be a large impervious surface areas, and there's so many new technologies now with pavers or bricks or different sort of things that are impervious, but those take maintenance also. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of talk about them right now. I was on the Carver County Water Group, and there's a great deal of talk about that, but it's just going to be the nature of the beast. It's going to be like stormwater ponds 5-10 years from now. They're going to fill up, and it's not going to do what it's supposed to. So, we got to think about that and make arrangements for those sort of things also.
Absolutely. All right, I think we're getting close to the end here. So the next section that we called out, and in fact, I think this might be our last section, related to residential planned unit development. So we had some discussion. I think the initial red line deviated a little bit from the DNR's model, and we were trying to maybe require some shoreline dedication versus just the 50% open space. Based on our previous conversations, we have reverted that back to what the DNR model language says related to those PUD requirements. As was stated by our first public hearing caller, at least their feedback was that the city should consider having some sort of ability to be able to be flexible in those instances where the nature of the site doesn't necessarily allow for that. So that's, again, something for the commission to consider if we want to look at building in any of that additional flexibility. But based on our meeting with Lakes and Water Quality, and I think it was brought up in our last joint session, was the question about changing to the tiering structure. So just as a refresher, there was some conversation, I believe the way that the PUD ordinance is written in the DNR model is that once you've run through your calculation and figured out how many units you can fit within tier, you're then allowed some bonus density, and that is 50% in the first tier, 100% increase in the second tier, and then a 200% increase in the third and beyond tiers. And there was conversation in the Lakes and Water Quality Committee meeting about do we want to reduce that first tier bonus to try to discourage some of the shoreline clustering and make that up in the second or beyond tier. So for example, instead of 50, the first tier is 25% bonus, and then instead of 100, the second tier is 125% bonus. There was some discussion about does that really make that much of a difference if you're moving that impervious surface up 267 feet or whatever that tier is as compared to down here, and what's the totality of that? But that was something that the Lakes and Water Quality Committee wanted to be considered.
Yeah, I think that was, if I remember correctly, one of those points that we did discuss for quite a while. And I just, my thought with this is, and I agree with our first applicant tonight who, over the phone, I think we need, I don't see PUDs as developers walking all over a city. I see it the opposite. I see it the city holding developers to a higher standard, and I think this fits into that. I think allowing that bonus gives them some flexibility. We still have to agree to it. It doesn't mean we're going to grant it by any means. But I think, personally, I think it's fair to developers and to people that own land that are potentially selling land. I think it's fair. It's not allowing them. It's not a get out of jail free card or pass. It's still going to have to pass planning commission, city council. Just some flexibility. I know I'm going to get some pushback from one of our city community groups, but that's my thought on that.
One question I have in my mind is, are these future development lakes, are they going to have public access? So if that's one way to reduce some concerns, fine, don't make it have public access, right? That's one consideration. We have a few lakes here that have public access, so maybe that's an option.
So just to clarify, am I hearing we're comfortable with the DNR model ordinance on the tiering, the way it's written presently?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, that summed it up really quick.
So we talked about the tiering feedback. There was some questions, and this is, I think, more of an internal staff, we've got to talk to the DNR about this, but to have some better understanding of how tiering works when it's adjacent to a wetland, and if that wetland is below the ordinary high water level. I think staff's assumption is that if that wetland is connected to the water body and it's below the water level, well, your ordinary high water line now extends up to the wetland, so you're expanding out, but we do need to get some clarification on that just to make sure that is the case. And then there was some discussion about making sure that floodplain requirements are at least incorporated by reference, that they exist, but to at least tie that in by reference to this ordinance. And I don't know that we need to go into detail on this again. And that concludes my presentation, just an updated tentative timeline on how we're looking to move forward with this. So we had our public hearing this evening. We do have 2 additional planning commission meetings that we have available to discuss as we move forward. We have 1 additional Lakes and Water Quality Committee meeting to discuss before bringing it before the council at the end of August. Based on some of the discussion and the things we've talked about tonight, I think my intent will be to for sure bring this back on the 4th. I'm hoping that by the 4th, we can have a somewhat clean version of the ordinance, so try to get a sense of where that's landing. We'll bring back some of the information we discussed today that we're still looking for a little more clarification. We can also bring back some potential language on some of those flexibility items based on the public feedback we received, and move forward from there.
Thank you. Questions, comments? Okay. Well, that's it for the discussion items. Last item, any miscellaneous? Commissioners, or let's start with staff.
None from staff.
Miscellaneous? Okay. Commissioners? Hearing none, may I have a motion to close our planning commission meeting tonight? Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, nay. Hearing none, motion carries. Planning commission meeting is officially closed.